Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. David Daniels, a 38-year-old architect known for designing homes that felt like sanctuaries, was used to seeing the best in people. His calm demeanor and sharp eye for detail had earned him respect in his field and admiration from his friends. At home, life seemed equally well constructed. He and Sophia, his wife of 7 years, shared a warm, stylish townhouse in a suburban neighborhood just outside Seattle. Sophia's vibrant laughter often filled the house, and their conversations were the envy of their friends, a blend of humor, intellect, and mutual respect. Or so David thought. It was a crisp Friday evening when Sophia first brought up the idea. They were in their living room, unwinding after a long week. A glass of red wine in her hand, Sophia was perched on the edge of their couch, her expression unusually pensive. David sat opposite her, reviewing blueprints for an upcoming project. The sound of the fireplace crackling between them should have felt cozy, but there was a tension in the air that David couldn't quite place. "David," Sophia began, her voice soft but deliberate. He glanced up, her tone immediately catching his attention. "There's something I've been thinking about. Something I need to talk to you about." David set his papers aside, concern flashing across his face. "What is it? Is everything okay?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "You remember Ethan?" she said, finally meeting his gaze. David frowned. Ethan. The name stirred something in him, a faint unease he couldn't quite articulate. Ethan was Sophia's ex-boyfriend from her college years, a figure David had only heard about in passing. "What about him?" "Reached out to me recently," Sophia admitted. "He's going through some things, and it got me thinking. I never really had proper closure with him. We ended things so abruptly back then, and now with him reaching out, I feel like I need it. For my own peace of mind." David blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "Closure? What do you mean, exactly?" Sophia leaned forward, placing her glass on the coffee table. Just one night to meet with him, talk things through, and finally close that chapter of my life. It's been hanging over me for years, and I think it would help me move forward with no lingering questions or regrets." David's chest tightened. He searched her face for some hint that this was a joke, but Sophia's expression was earnest. "You want to spend a night with him?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Just to talk," Sophia said quickly. "I wouldn't even consider it if it wasn't important. But you and I have such a strong relationship, David. I trust us. Don't you?" The question hung in the air between them. David rubbed the back of his neck, trying to process what she was asking. Trust? He'd trusted her, yes, but this felt different. Off balance. He tried to mask his unease with logic. "Closure doesn't usually require a whole night," he said carefully. "And why now, after all this time?" Sophia sighed, her frustration barely concealed. "I knew you'd react this way. It's not about time, David. It's about emotional clarity. If I don't do this, I'll always wonder what might have been, even if it's just on some subconscious level." David studied her, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss the idea outright, to shut it down and move on. But her plea sounded sincere. And hadn't he always prided himself on being the kind of husband who listened, who trusted? But this request, this was a test of trust he hadn't anticipated. "Let me think about it," he said finally, buying himself time. Sophia nodded, looking relieved. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." Later that night, as Sophia slept peacefully beside him, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The words "one night" repeated in his mind like an echo. Something felt off about the whole thing, a fissure in the foundation of the trust they'd built. But he couldn't pinpoint whether it was paranoia or his instincts trying to warn him. David had spent the better part of the weekend mulling over Sophia's request. On the surface, it sounded simple, a conversation between two adults to close a chapter that had ended years ago. But the undertones, the context of a one-night meeting gnawed at him. It wasn't like Sophia to bring up old relationships, let alone with such urgency. And yet, she'd seemed so earnest, so convinced that this was necessary. By Monday morning, David had decided to address the matter head-on. Over breakfast, while Sophia moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, he broached the subject. "I've been thinking about what you asked," he began, his tone neutral. Sophia looked up from her cup of coffee, her face brightening. "And?" David hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "I want to trust you on this, but I need to understand why this is coming up now. I mean, it's been years, Sophia. Why does it feel so urgent now?" Sophia sighed, setting her mug down. "David, it's not about urgency. It's about timing. When Ethan reached out, it stirred up things I hadn't realized were still there. It's not like I'm questioning our relationship. I'm not. But I feel like if I don't deal with this now, it'll always be this shadow in the back of my mind." David frowned. A shadow? Sophia, we've built a life together. We've moved past those years, haven't we?" She reached across the table and took his hand, her eyes soft with affection. "We have. But sometimes the past lingers in ways we don't expect. Look, Ethan and I had a messy breakup, and I never really got closure. It's not about him, David. It's about me." Her sincerity was disarming, but it didn't fully quiet the storm inside him. And, and you're sure one conversation will give you that closure?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It's all I need." David nodded slowly. "If that's what you feel you need, then I'll support you. But I want transparency, Sophia. No ambiguity, no secrets." Her face lit up and she leaned forward to kiss him. "Thank you, David. I promise, nothing about this is a secret." Despite her reassurances, unease lingered in the pit of his stomach as he drove to work that morning. Trust was something they had always shared, and yet, for the first time, David felt it teetering. It wasn't just Sophia's request. It was the way she had framed it, as though it were something she had rehearsed. As the day went on, David's mind wandered. He tried to focus on the project at hand, a sprawling modern home with intricate lighting designs. But Sophia's words kept replaying in his mind. "It's not about him, it's about me." By late afternoon, David couldn't resist his growing curiosity. He logged into their shared phone account, something he'd never felt the need to do before. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but when he saw the call logs, his heart sank. Sophia had been in contact with Ethan several times over the past month. Short calls, long calls, enough to make David's stomach churn. She hadn't mentioned any of this. Wasn't this the kind of transparency she had promised? He closed the browser window quickly, his chest tightening with guilt and frustration. Maybe he was overreacting. People could reconnect for all kinds of reasons, right? That evening, David tried to act as though nothing was amiss. He helped Sophia with dinner, asked her about her day, laughed at her recounting of a funny moment at work, but the nagging thought persisted. Why hadn't she told him about the calls? As they settled on the couch to watch a movie, Sophia's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it quickly, her movements almost reflexive. David couldn't help but glance at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." Sophia placed the phone face down, without a word. "Who was that?" David asked, keeping his tone light. She looked at him, startled for a moment, before smiling. "Oh, just work. Nothing important." David felt his chest tighten further. She was lying. The realization struck him harder than he expected. Trust wasn't just about grand gestures or big promises. It was about the little things, the honesty in moments that seemed inconsequential. And in that moment, David felt a fissure widen between them. As Sophia leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, David felt a deep conflict within. He had agreed to her request, but the question remained, was he being a supportive partner, or was he ignoring the signs of something far more serious? David decided that tomorrow, while Sophia met with Ethan, he would find out the truth. The following evening, David watched Sophia get ready. She was meticulous, her attention to detail strikingly evident. She chose a soft blue dress that she said was casual but elegant, pairing it with the pearl necklace he had given her on their 5th anniversary. Watching her, David couldn't help but feel like a spectator to a performance. "You look beautiful," he said, the words tasting bittersweet as they left his mouth. Sophia smiled at him in the mirror. "Thank you, I won't be too late." She kissed his cheek before leaving, her scent lingering in the room like a ghost. As soon as the door clicked shut, David's mask of calmness dropped. His heart raced, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. This wasn't the man he wanted to be, second-guessing his wife, prying into her life. But the message from Ethan, the calls, and now this secretive meeting felt like puzzle pieces that refused to fit into the life they'd built together. He had made up his mind earlier that day. It wasn't enough to let her go without question. He needed to know for himself what was happening. He grabbed his keys and jacket, leaving the house a few minutes after her. Sophia's car was easy to spot in the lot of the Willow, an upscale wine bar on the edge of town. The place was cozy and intimate, a popular spot for romantic dinners. David parked at a distance, his heart pounding. From the shadows, he saw Sophia enter the bar, greeted by a man who could only be Ethan. Tall, sharp-featured, and confident, he fit the image of the suave college flame David had pieced together from Sophia's occasional stories. Ethan leaned in for a hug, his hands lingering on her waist longer than David would have liked. David stayed outside, watching them through the large glass windows. He didn't know what he'd expected, but seeing them together ignited a cocktail of emotions: anger, sadness, and a growing sense of betrayal. They were seated close to each other, their body language easy and familiar. Sophia was smiling, her face lit with an expression David hadn't seen in years. For a moment, he felt like an intruder, a man spying on a moment that wasn't his to witness. He turned away, considering leaving and confronting Sophia later. But as he moved back toward his car, something made him hesitate. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his best friend and coworker, Greg. "Big meeting tomorrow. Don't let Sophia wear you out tonight." David stared at the text, the humor in it feeling almost cruel given the circumstances. But it was enough to steel his resolve. He wasn't leaving until he knew what was happening inside. He walked into the wine bar, his heart a hammer in his chest. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses did little to soothe his nerves. He stayed near the entrance, out of their line of sight, observing. Sophia and Ethan were deep in conversation, their heads close together. Ethan's hand brushed hers as he spoke, his face animated. Sophia laughed softly, her hand resting briefly on his arm. David's throat tightened. Whatever this was, it didn't look like closure. He moved closer, his footsteps quiet against the polished wooden floor. The bar's ambient lighting cast shadows across their table, giving David a view that felt painfully intimate. Then he heard it. "You've always been the one, Sophia," Hathan said, his voice low but audible in the quiet corner of the room. Sophia hesitated, her fingers playing with the stem of her wineglass. Ethan, we talked about this. I'm married now. But are you happy?" Ethan pressed, leaning closer. "We had something real, something special, and I think we can have it again." David froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. "I can't," Sophia started, her voice wavering. "You've already come this far," Ethan said softly, his hand covering hers. "Don't tell me you don't feel it too." David stepped forward, his presence suddenly undeniable. Both of them looked up, Sophia's eyes widening in shock as she saw him. "David," she stammered, pulling her hand away from Ethan's. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," David said, his voice calm but firm. His gaze shifted to Ethan, who looked both surprised and annoyed. "Ethan, I presume?" Ethan rose from his chair, his expression shifting to one of controlled confidence. "And you must be David." David ignored the extended hand. "I think it's time we had a conversation, Sophia." Sophia's face flushed, her eyes darting between the two men. "David, this isn't what it looks like." "Really?" David said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Because it looks exactly like what it looks like." The silence between them was deafening. Sophia's lips parted as if to explain, but no words came out. Ethan, sensing the tension, picked up his coat. "I'll let you two talk," he said smoothly, casting a glance at Sophia before walking away. David watched him leave, his chest tightening with every step. When he turned back to Sophia, her eyes were filled with tears. "David, Save it," he said, his voice cold. "We'll talk at home." He turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Sophia behind. The night air was crisp, biting against his skin as he reached his car. His mind was a storm of emotions, but one thing was clear. Whatever trust they had was now fractured beyond repair. David drove home in silence, the hum of the engine a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. The night felt heavy, its shadows pressing in around him as he replayed the scene at the wine bar. Ethan's words, Sophia's hesitation, the way her hand had rested on Ethan's, all of it etched into his memory. He parked in their driveway, the familiar sight of their townhouse now tinged with an unfamiliar bitterness. This home, once a symbol of their partnership and dreams, felt like a facade. David stepped inside and sat in the living room, the quietness of the space amplifying his turmoil. It was nearly an hour later when the sound of the front door opening broke the stillness. Sophia entered cautiously, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with redness. She stopped when she saw David sitting on the couch, his expression unreadable. "You're home," she said softly, as if testing the waters. David didn't respond immediately. He motioned for her to sit down, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk, Sophia." She sat across from him, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I want you to tell me everything," David said finally, breaking the silence. "No excuses, no dodging the truth. Start from the beginning." Sophia nodded, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. "I didn't mean for it to come to this," she began, her voice trembling. "When Ethan reached out, it caught me off guard. At first it was just messages, casual, polite. But then he started bringing up the past." David's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. Said he had regrets, she continued, about how we ended things, about how he treated me back then, and it brought back feelings, not feelings for him, she added quickly, seeing the look in David's eyes, but unresolved emotions, confusion, hurt, questions I never had the chance to ask. So you decided to meet with him, David said, his tone even. Sophia hesitated. Yes, but it wasn't about rekindling anything. I just needed to hear him out, to find closure. And what about tonight? David asked, leaning forward. What was that? Because it didn't look like closure, Sophia. It looked like something else entirely. She flinched at the accusation, her voice rising defensively. It wasn't like that. He tried to bring up the past again, to suggest something more, but I told him no. I told him I'm married, that I chose you, David. David's laugh was humorless, cutting through her words. You chose me? Is that why you've been sneaking around, taking his calls and lying about your plans? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't feel like I was your choice. Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how to explain it. I was afraid you wouldn't understand. David shook his head, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. What I don't understand is how you could think this was okay. You had every opportunity to talk to me, to be honest about what you were feeling. Instead, you went behind my back. You lied, Sophia. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I made mistakes, but it wasn't because I didn't care about us. It was because I didn't want to lose what we have. David leaned back, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. Do you even realize how ironic that sounds? You didn't want to lose what we have, so you risked everything we built for a conversation with a man you left behind years ago. Sophia buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but audible. David watched her, his own emotions swirling, anger, sadness, betrayal, and a faint, flickering ember of hope. Tell me the truth, Sophia, he said after a long pause. If I hadn't shown up tonight, would you have told me about it? About the meeting, about his proposition? She lifted a head, her face streaked with tears. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe not right away. I thought I could handle it on my own, that it didn't have to involve you. David closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. That's the problem, Sophia. You didn't think I should be involved in something that affects both of us. You made decisions for yourself without considering what it would do to me. To us. She reached for his hand, her touch hesitant. I'm so sorry, David. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just... I didn't know how to face this. David pulled his hand away, standing up and pacing the room. Maybe that's the real issue, Sophia. If you can't face things with me, then what does that say about us? Her sobs deepened, but David couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Instead, he walked toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom step. I need time to think, he said, his voice hollow. We both do. He climbed the stairs, leaving Sophia alone in the living room, her cries echoing softly in the space they once shared. Upstairs, David sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the floor. He'd never felt more uncertain about their future, or about the woman he thought he knew so well. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Sophia tried to bridge the growing gap with gestures, making David's favored meals, leaving little notes by his coffee cup in the mornings, but none of it addressed the deeper chasm between them. David couldn't decide whether her actions were out of guilt or genuine remorse. Either way, they felt hollow. He spent his nights in the guest room, a place that had once been nothing more than a storage space, but now served as a physical symbol of the emotional distance between them. The house felt colder, the echoes of their laughter replaced by tension and quiet resentment. David threw himself into his work, immersing himself in blueprints and designs as if they could distract him from the unraveling of his marriage. At the office, his colleagues noticed his newfound intensity, attributing it to an important project deadline. He let them believe it. It was easier than explaining the truth. Meanwhile, Sophia kept trying to repair the damage. One evening, she suggested counseling, her voice trembling with hope. "We can fix this, David," she pleaded. "We just need someone to help us navigate it. I know I made mistakes, but I don't want to lose you." David met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Do you want to fix this for us, Sophia, or because you're afraid of what life looks like without us?" Her silence spoke volumes, and David shook his head, walking away without waiting for an answer. The following weekend, David made a decision. It wasn't sudden. Rather, it was the result of days of introspection and nights spent replaying every moment of their relationship in his mind. He thought about their wedding day, the promises they'd made, and the countless memories they'd created together. He thought about her betrayal, the lies, and the cracks in their foundation that he'd never noticed until now. On Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, David sat at the dining table with Sophia. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone steady but heavy. Sophia looked up from her coffee, her eyes wide with apprehension. "We built something good, you and I," David said, "but somewhere along the way, we stopped being honest with each other. Maybe it was complacency, or maybe it was something deeper. I don't know. What I do know is that trust is the foundation of any relationship. And ours has been fractured." "I know," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking. "But fractures can heal, David. We can rebuild." "Can we?" he interrupted gently. "Because I'm not sure we even know how. You lied to me, Sophia. You kept things from me that you should have trusted me with. And now I'm struggling to believe that this is something we can come back from." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't interrupt. "I've always thought of myself as someone who could forgive," David continued, his voice softening. "But this isn't just about forgiveness. It's about what this has done to the foundation of our marriage. I can't unhear the things Ethan said to you. I can't unsee the way you looked at him. And I can't ignore the fact that you let him have a place in your life that should have been reserved for me." Sophia's sobs grew louder, but David remained composed, his own tears threatening but held back by sheer will. "I need space," he said finally. "Time to figure out who I am outside of this marriage. Maybe we'll find our way back to each other. Or maybe we won't, but right now I can't keep living like this." Sophia nodded, her shoulders shaking. "If that's what you need, I'll give it to you. But I'll never stop hoping, David. Never." David stood, his heart heavy but resolute. "Hope is a good thing, Sophia. But sometimes it's not enough." That evening, David packed a suitcase. He didn't take much, just enough to get by for a while. As he walked out the door, Sophia stood in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. David paused, looking at her one last time. "So am I." He got into his car and drove away, unsure of where the road would take him, but certain that he needed to find himself again. The weight of the past few weeks began to lift, replaced by the uncertain but liberating feeling of starting over. As the miles stretched out before him, David allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope, not for his marriage, but for the person he was yet to become. Sometimes he thought rebuilding meant starting from scratch, and that was a future he was finally ready to face.